America's new isolationist movement has been trained to see President Donald J. Trump as an ally of American cultural conservatism in opposition to neoliberalism, a skeptic of foreign intervention, and therefore tough on Ukraine. This image of Trump as a Russian sympathizer has been bolstered by a media slurry of anti Trump hysteria and propaganda. Whether or not Trump deserves the hate he's received, or whether he stands out as a uniquely horrible politician, is irrelevant to this particular discussion. Here we are referring solely to his geopolitical ambitions. Few people have stopped to wonder, what if all of this has been theater? What if all of the pro Russian sentiment from Donald Trump has been nothing more than an elaborate show which has kept the dominant isolationist wing of the Republican Party placated, while at the same time ensuring that Ukraine remains an ally of the United States? A closer analysis shows that this can be the only rational explanation for all of Trump's diplomatic and policy moves since he first took office in 2017. All of this really began on June 20th of 2017. Cameras caught him greeting Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko with the classic Trump handshake, firm and just a touch condescending. The White House blandly reported after the meeting, quote, "We discussed support for a peaceful resolution in eastern Ukraine." But the real story here is to be found in what Trump doesn't do after taking office. The sanctions on Russia remained unaltered, and security cooperation with Kiev, in fact, intensified. By September of 2017, Trump had signed a bill banning Russia's Kaspersky Lab from U.S. government agencies. Then December arrives, and the Trump administration hands down sanctions on 100 individuals tied to Russia's annexation of Crimea, as well as the Donbas conflict, explicitly targeting Russia's elites and their financial lifelines. The new media narrative was simultaneously that some sort of thaw was occurring between the US and Russia. Looking back, this was completely laughable. By March of 2018, 60 Russian diplomats were given the boot from the United States in lockstep with the decisions of various European capitals. Was this just another mixed signal? Was Trump still cozying up to Putin? No, Trump was already isolating Moscow's diplomatic network and intentionally starving it of international influence. Then April rolls around. The first ever shipment of lethal Javelin anti-tank missiles lands in Ukraine, some 47 million USD worth, according to Reuters. Simultaneously, Trump assigns a sanctions package against 24 Russian oligarchs, calling it a punishment for malign activity, including election meddling and aggression in Ukraine. By July of 2018, Mike Pompeo stands before the United Nations and declares that the U.S. will never recognize Crimea's annexation. A month later, Trump tightens export controls on Russian missile components, targeting two Russian defense firms for alleged violations of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is followed by a dramatic and entirely stage-managed aid freeze in summer of 2019. On June 18th of 2019, the Pentagon publicly announced 250 million USD for additional training, equipment, and advisory efforts to build up Ukraine's armed forces. On July 3rd, Jennifer Williams, the Russia advisor to Vice President Pence, testifies that OMB has placed an informal hold on that bundle of security aid. July 25th, Trump calls Zelensky to ask for an investigation into the Biden family and about some conspiracy theory claim about the DNC. After less than 3 months, the hold is lifted. In other words, Trump froze Ukraine aid at precisely the moment that he was demanding personal political favors. This was undeniably coercive, abusive, and corrupt, but was this done so that Trump could move cards towards Russia's favor? No, this hold was made over stupid concerns brought to Trump by his base of support and then released once Trump had concluded his political stunt. This was nothing other than a political maneuver meant to appease domestic supporters, but all the American people remembered was that Trump pivoted. September rolls around and the administration releases the 250 million USD in Congress-approved aid. Then, only 3 months later, on December 20th of 2019, Trump signs the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020, which included Section 7503D, which, mind you, was the Protecting Europe's Energy Security Act, or PESA, of 2019. Under PESA, any vessel involved in the pipelaying of Russia's Nord Stream 2 at depths of 100 feet or more was required to immediately cease construction-related activity and enter a good faith wind-down or face targeted sanctions via the OFAC. This wasn't just a sideshow. Nord Stream 2 was, of course, going to allow Russia to bypass Ukrainian transit routes and cut Kiev off from substantial fee revenues, which would then deepen its vulnerability to Kremlin coercion. It also would have amplified Europe's dependence on Russian gas, which then would have given Moscow leverage over both energy prices and political decisions in Germany. For that reason, the Trump administration joined a whole host of European governments in condemning the pipeline and championed the diversification of energy supplies, and indeed, US LNG exports reportedly saved European consumers some 8 billion USD by fostering competitive pricing. The NDAA gave the Secretary of State 60 days to name any non compliant entities and 30 days after that to demonstrate a wind down or face sanctions. Then, following the expiration of Trump's presidential term, came Joseph Biden, and the story shifted. In 2021, the new administration rolled out General License 8L, which allowed certain Russian firms to bypass American sanctions. CIA Director William Burns then opened a back channel to Putin and, in fact, warned Kiev not to strike within Russian territory. That should have set off alarms, as while Moscow plowed ahead with its war crimes, Washington was telling Ukraine to stand down. But the headlines fixated on moralizing about Trump's speeches, and America once again swallowed the narrative on this subject. On April 6th of 2021, Senator Marco Rubio, who would later be appointed as both Trump's Secretary of State and later as the interim national security advisor, gave support to Senate Bill 814, which authorized the State Department to give grants or loans for U.S. defense equipment and training to Ukraine, and granted Ukraine priority access to excess defense articles under foreign military financing and IMET programs. However, it is important that under Biden, the first major Ukraine aid package of 13.6 billion USD was passed, known as House Resolution 2471, which was part of a 1.5 trillion omnibus package passed by the House on March 9th of 2022 and then by the Senate on March 10th. Representative Mike Waltz, who would later become Trump's national security advisor and then the ambassador to the UN, voted yes on the package in the House. In April of 2022, both Rubio and Waltz also gave support to the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the US president to send military equipment to Ukraine and other Eastern European allies with the explicit goal of deterring Russia's expansionism. The second package, House Resolution 7691, consisted of 40.1 billion USD and was passed in the House on May 10th and the Senate on May 19th of 2022. Both Waltz and Rubio together voted in favor of this package. Mike Waltz then voted in favor of House Resolution 5692 of 2024, which was a standalone 2024 fiscal year defense supplemental passed in the House on September 28th of 2023. Note, both Rubio and Waltz voted for both the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act as well as the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. The 2023 NDAA, in Section 1241, extended the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative into fiscal year 2024 with 300 million USD for equipment and training. The 2024 NDAA maintained and expanded USAI funding through to 2026. These are the people who would later and presently do spearhead Trump's foreign policy. January 20th, 2025, Trump comes back to office pretending as though he's going to shut down all of America's foreign aid. Despite this rhetoric, he appoints Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and names Mike Waltz National Security Advisor. 2 days later, he blasts on Truth Social, "If a deal is not reached, I will have no other choice but to put high-level taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and other participating countries." Early February, he pitches a quid pro quo, U.S. military aid for Ukraine in exchange for rare earth minerals. Russia rebukes Trump's proposal as commodifying war support. One will find that in the earliest days of the second Trump administration, all of the troubles regarding America's relations with Ukraine can be shown to stem from the unauthorized actions or statements of Pete Hegseth, Trump's Secretary of Defense. In early February, without presidential approval, Pete Hegseth ordered Transportation Command to ground 11 military cargo flights loaded with artillery shells and munitions bound for Ukraine. These flights, originating from Delaware and Qatar, were halted for several days at a cost of up to 2.2 million USD in cancellation fees. The fact is, however, that no senior White House, Pentagon, or State Department officials were ever informed of the suspension, and only learned of it when Ukrainian partners in Kiev and liaison cells in Poland began inquiring about the missing shipments. On February 5th, Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, intervened and resumed all aid flights immediately. Reuters published an expose about this on May 6th of 2025, revealing that Trump himself, alongside his chief national security officials, had been completely unaware of this order given by Hegseth throughout the entire ordeal. On February 11th, Pete Hegseth then proclaims that no U.S. combat troops will ever go to Ukraine. Only a few days after that, Hegseth spontaneously backtracks his earlier qualifying statements, instead revealing everything's on the table and even flirts with the idea of granting Ukraine nuclear weapons. The only reasonable conclusion which can be drawn from this 180 in Hegseth's statements is that disciplinary action was taken against him behind closed doors. By the end of February, Trump extended sanctions against Russia for another year, extensions which have tightened the noose on Russia's economy while Ukraine's lifeline has by all means stayed robust. On February 28th, an interesting show occurred where Zelensky visited the White House only to be berated by Trump ruthlessly, grilled on classical GOP talking points. Trump constantly interrupted Zelensky, accusing him of endangering millions, and dismissed Ukraine's chances of victory. But some citizens saw through this facade and recognized what it was. This was a show. It was meant to play up to Donald Trump's isolationist support base. Trump confirmed this interpretation after the fact, stating that the visit, quote, made for good TV. Early March, Trump quotes Zelensky stating Ukraine is ready to negotiate. On March 7th, Trump warns of large-scale banking sanctions against Russia until a final peace agreement is reached. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent promises Ukraine that America will go all in. Even Elon Musk, a notable pro-Russian cabinet member, stated on March 9th, to be extremely clear, no matter how much I disagree with the Ukraine policy, Starlink will never turn off its terminals. On March 10th, Marco Rubio affirmed to reporters that the U.S. had engaged in no discussions with the EU on easing any sanctions against Russia. March 11th sees a whirlwind meeting in Jeddah where Marco Rubio presented a 30-day ceasefire proposal to Russia, stating ball in Moscow's court. On the same day, Mike Watz confirms the resumption of military aid to Ukraine roughly a week after its temporary suspension. On March 12th, Trump refuses to renew Biden's General License 8L as it expires. That move alone slashes €5 billion annually from Russia's oil revenues. Was this just some sort of technicality, some sort of performative move? No, because the elimination of the general license sanction loophole was one of the biggest blows to Russia's sanction evasion. Trump accompanied this with a dire warning stating very bad financial measures await Moscow. Come March 30th, Trump is threatening Russia directly, stating if Russia does not make a deal to stop the war in Ukraine, I'll impose 25 to 50% secondary tariffs on all Russian oil. If you buy oil from Russia, you can't do business in the US. These tariffs, though not yet implemented, would target primarily China, India, and Turkey. Whether these countries balk or not, Russia's bargaining chips are being forced out of their hands. April 11th, Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, proposes a reassurance force led by the UK and France in western Ukraine, as well as a concentration of Ukrainian troops east of the Dnipro River, where a demilitarized zone would be established around the current lines of control between Russia and Ukraine. This proposal, however, was taken out of context by the news media, which made slanderous reports that Kellogg was somehow proposing dividing Ukraine like post-war Germany was. On April 13th, Kellogg condemned Russia directly, stating today's Palm Sunday attack by Russian forces on civilian targets in Sumy crosses any line of decency. On April 25th, according to the New York Times, the White House officially rejected Russia's demands for Ukraine's full withdrawal from partially occupied oblasts. On April 26th, the next day, at Pope Francis's funeral, Trump met with Zelensky on the sidelines, and during that meeting, sources gave reports that Zelensky informed Trump that Putin would not budge unless Trump applied more pressure, to which Trump replied that he might have to change his approach to Putin. Zelensky then attempted to convince Trump to return to his initial proposal of an unconditional ceasefire as a starting point for peace talks, which, as Zelensky points out, Ukraine had accepted. One source reported that Trump seemed to agree with Zelensky's proposal, a report which the White House didn't confirm or deny. On his way back to the US, Trump posted on Truth Social following a Russian missile attack in Ukraine, "It makes me think that maybe he, Putin, doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions." On April 27th, Trump stated, "I want Putin to stop shooting, sit down and sign a deal. We have the confines of a deal, I believe, and I want him to sign it and be done with it." On April 28th, Ukraine signs a memorandum on U.S.-Ukrainian mineral rights, hailed by Mike Waltz as America's economic stake in Ukraine's future. As Russian shells continue to fall, the U.S. locks in the resources that will rebuild Ukraine and binds Washington's own economy to Kiev's success. According to U.S. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce, Rubio demanded from Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov that the war be brought to an end immediately. Keith Kellogg denounced Putin's three-day ceasefire as absurd.
And a three-day ceasefire is absurd. What the president wants is a permanent, comprehensive ceasefire, sea, air, land, infrastructure, for a minimum of 30 days, and then we can extend that. No, look, Dana, Russia's not winning this war. Russia has not made any major advances in the last year and a half. They haven't taken the city of Kyiv, the capital. They haven't pushed to the west of the Dnipro River, which is a major obstacle. They haven't taken Odessa. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they haven't really moved anything. It moves by meters, not by miles. And the Ukrainians are fighting on their own soil. They're fighting hard. So when Russia says they're winning, no, they're not. If they are winning, they've already won this war after 3 years, and now we're into our fourth year. So I think they need to sit back and realize it. I think the Ukrainians are in a good position.
May 1st came as I was drafting this video up, and the State Department by now has approved 50 million USD in aid or more to Ukraine for the sales of defense hardware and services. Ukraine's parliament prepared to ratify the long-waiting US-Ukraine Minerals Agreement signed on April 30th, which grants the US preferential access to Ukrainian critical minerals while establishing a joint investment fund to support Ukraine's reconstruction and defense projects. The Institute for the Study of War reported that Russia became angered at American and European proposals for Western peacekeeping forces in Ukraine that same day. On May 2nd, the US finalized a package of economic sanctions targeting Russian banking and energy sectors, sanctions which Zelensky had proposed to Trump during his meeting with Trump at the funeral of Pope Francis. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican isolationist politician, began fuming at Trump, complaining, "I represent the base, and when I'm frustrated and upset over the direction of things, you better be clear the base is not happy. I campaigned for no more foreign wars, and on top of that, now we are told that we have signed a deal for mineral rights in Ukraine. So why on earth would we go over and occupy Ukraine and spend an untold amount of future American taxpayer dollars defending and mining their minerals, as well as potentially putting American lives at risk in future war?" Following this, a Trump advisor reported that Trump was shooting down Marjorie Taylor Greene's dreams of running in the Senate, shooting back by stating the president, like the governor, wants someone who can win. May 4th, Trump made the following statement regarding the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Within hours of that statement, the New York Times reported that the U.S. has been planning to transfer a Patriot air defense system from the state of Israel to Ukraine. May 5th, the Senate moved forward with the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, introduced by the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and co-sponsored by 70 senators, half of them Republicans. The act would impose a 500% tariff on energy imports from Russia, expand secondary sanctions, block Russian access to U.S. capital markets, including uranium imports, and tighten restrictions on sovereign debt and financial transactions involving Kremlin linked entities. Trump has publicly endorsed the bill's substance. In fact, he is the one who proposed secondary sanctions on Russia, and it is clear that he intends to sign the now veto proof resolution into law. But hasn't Mike Waltz, the Trump administration's most pro Ukraine hawk, already been fired? On May 1st, President Trump publicly announced that he was moving Waltz from the position of National Security Advisor to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, replacing him immediately with Secretary of State Marco Rubio in an interim capacity. This is, of course, in part due to the Signal group chat leak, which occurred recently, but more importantly because the intended UN Ambassador Stefanik was dismissed from her nomination for the position, and the Trump administration has desperately needed a new nominee since then. Yet, in truth, Waltz hasn't really left the National Security Council and is still among its regular attendees. This is because the position which he has been moved to, which is the ambassador to the UN, still has a permanent seat at the National Security Council. So why are you still told that Trump is tough on Ukraine? Because the illusion of isolationism keeps his base of support from revolting, but the real story is that Donald Trump has been the most consistently pro-Ukraine president since the conflict started in 2014, overtly reinforcing Kiev's defenses, economically strangling Moscow, and binding U.S. global economic power to Ukraine's survival. The unfortunate thing for GOP voters is that they have simply been conned into celebrating a performance rather than evaluating the results, allowing the narrative masters of the same news media they despise to frame Trump as an isolationist who hates Ukraine, a narrative which has been curated to keep you from realizing that Trump has been the largest force standing between Russia and a triumphant conquest of Ukraine. It's the greatest bait and switch in modern American politics, and you're the ones who fell for it.